الجماعات الإسلامية دي أخطر ما عشان نبقى عارفينها يعني، أخطر ما فيها المفاهيم اللي بيحطوها في عقل أولادنا، وعشان الأحزاب اللي بتساعد دول يشوفوا، أو اللي بيحاولوا يتقربوا لهم، يشوفوا أي جريمة بترتكب في حق أجيالنا ومصر. فكر الناس دول إيه؟ فكر الناس دول حاجة اسمها الحاكمية، بمفهومها انه الحكم بما انزل الله ورفض اي قوانين وضعية. العنف، الايمان بحتمية الاصطدام مع السلطة الكافرة والمجتمع الجاهلي والقضاء عليه، اخطر ما فيها بقى، ودي اللي بذرها الاخوان المسلمين. وجوب مبايعة امير الجماعة والالتزام بمبدأ السمع والطاعة له في جميع الظروف. يعني والله ما بيحتموا هذا لله سبحانه وتعالى اللي يستحق ان احنا السمع والطاعة بلا جدال، انما بيطبقوها لامير الجماعة. وبعدين عشان يفضل بقى في الدايرة عدم الاخذ باي مذهب من المذاهب في التفسير للقرآن والسنة، والاعتماد فقط على تفسير امير الجماعة للايات القرآنية والاحاديث النبوية.
I should like them to write on my tomb, he has lived for peace and he has died for principles.
Anwar Sadat, peacemaker of Egypt, killed in a military assassination. Tonight, in a special extended edition of Nightline, we'll focus on what lies ahead for Egypt, for the Middle East, and for the United States.
The current problem of religious extremism in Egypt against everyday society can date back decades. But what precipitated Islamic extremism in Egypt? Well, in this video, we're going to talk about the origins of Islamic extremism in Egypt and how that influenced other extremist groups in other countries that we see today. The major influence of radical Islamic extremism can be traced back to the 6th century to the Kharijite period. Now, the Kharijites were an Islamic sect which appeared in the 1st century in Islam during the first Muslim civil war. The Kharijites believed that any Muslim, irrespective of his ethnicity, could become caliph or leader of the Muslims if this person was deemed a morally irreproachable person. However, if this certain leader had committed an act of sin, it was the duty of the Muslims to force or depose him out from as caliph. They branded other Muslims who sinned as apostates, and many Kharijite groups in the 1st century, in the 6th century, declared such apostates worthy of death. In the 7th century, the Kharijites were basically eliminated, and this school of thought became the influence for future Islamic theologians in the future, especially in Saudi Arabia, where it would influence one person, Muhammad ibn Abdul al-Wahhab, a nomad theologian in his own right, who was considered an ultra-conservative or a very austere Orthodox Sunni theologian, in which he believed that the Muslims should return back to the first and second centuries in the line of the Prophet Muhammad. These were called the caravan. And old age traditions, such as praying at the graves of Muhammad, foreigners in Mecca and Medina, were to be outlawed. These were considered un-Islamic. But his views were very radical, much like that of the Kharijites of the 6th century. But Muhammad ibn Abdul al-Wahhab would go on and to meet Muhammad ibn al-Saud, and together they would create the first Saudi state, which was called the Emirate of Diriyah, which would later become Saudi Arabia. In Egypt, the Kharijite movement itself was seen in the very early stages of the 19th and 20th century. Very minuscule, obscure Islamic schools of thought, groups, organizations, basically literates, people who were in the shadows under the government itself. In 1922, Egypt gained their independence from the monarchical rule of Great Britain. However, during the next 10 years, British influence would still be a stronghold in Egypt. And so, with this turn of events, King Farouk, who was considered a rich despot, and illiterate in his own right when it comes to Egyptian politics, class warfare was the big problem here. Even though by the 1940s, after World War II, Egypt was considered the richest state in the Middle East. However, there was a wide disparity of economic growth within the country. Over 500 millionaires were inside Egypt, but the majority of Egyptian society lived in abject poverty. Many of these people couldn't afford to eat on a daily basis. Many families would actually sell their sons and daughters to the Gulf states to become slaves, in which they have to, in return, pay them money. And this still happens even today in certain poor Arab regions. And so Egyptian society would have a very apparent war within the state itself, even though on the outset, King Farouk himself basically ignored the pleas of his own poor constituents in the country. This would come back and haunt him. And it would help to create the first Islamic organization in the Arab world. In 1928, a man by the name of Hassan al-Banna would help to create the Muslim Brotherhood. And at first, the Muslim Brotherhood only consisted of university professors and students, people who were literate in the Quran, in the Hadiths, and the primary basis of the Muslim Brotherhood was to consider the Quran and the Hadiths as the law of the Sunnah, in which they believed that all Arab governments, especially the Egyptian government, the secular Egyptian government, the only way that Egypt would prosper is for King Farouk to step down and to have any socialist government replaced with the Quran and the Sunnah, and that would act as the only law as the only governance of the people for Muslims by Muslims, and there is no compromise. In the very early stages, al-Banna, throughout the next 10 years, would see a growth because of the multitude of two factors. One, the Muslim Brotherhood believed that Great Britain influence needed to leave the country. Any type of Western influence in the country was considered a sin in its own right. So Great Britain and any Western influence was to be eliminated from Egyptian society. And of course, the ongoing class warfare that was transpiring in the country in itself. So the Muslim Brotherhood promised to eliminate both of those factors. And so with that, Sayyid Qutb, who was an author, a poet, and Islamic theologian in his own right, and was one of the leading members of the Muslim Brotherhood, most notably in the 50s and 60s, was basically at this time underground, not a very notable person within the early formats of the Muslim Brotherhood. He would later have reverberating effects for the country. Qutb, at first, was not an Islamist, not in the way that Hassan al-Banna was. Qutb was a university professor, didn't agree with the way education was being advocated in the country, nor was he somebody that advocated pure Islamism in Egypt. And so he basically was a critique early on with notable imams in the country. But later on, Sayyid Qutb would visit the United States in 1948 and 1950. At the Colorado State College for Education in Greeley, as well as Stanford University. He went there to further his education in educational administration. When he returned to Egypt in 1950-51, he basically became a full anti-Western advocate, was shocked at the level of waste and depravity that he saw in his country. He considered things like boxing to be primitive, jazz music to be abhorrent and sexually obtuse, considered Hollywood films to be degradatory forms of Western daily life, even though he enjoyed Westerns. And so he would go on to publish a manuscript called The America That I Have Seen, where he would explicitly become critical of the things that he observed in the United States, eventually encapsulating the West more generally, its materialism, individual freedoms, economic system, racism, along with its sporting events. He critiqued the freedoms of the American women, how they would dress in such a flashy dress, such as skirts. He also admonished their wastefulness in basic elements such as watering the grass, suggesting that the American citizen is entirely encapsulated with materialism, only caring more about their lawns than the basic needs of decency towards people of color. In the next 20 years, the Muslim Brotherhood grew because of the oppressive and politically inept government led by King Farouk. But there would be a change. In 1952, July of 1952, the Free Officers Movement, which was a pro-Western government headed by Lieutenant Gamel Abdel Nasser, as well as other officers such as Anwar Sadat, committed a coup d'etat against King Farouk, in which they won. The Free Officers Movement basically deposed King Farouk out of government. Nasser was not necessarily the president right away, but in short order, due to a disagreement within who would head the government, whether it would be the Free Officers Movement as a whole, or with other individuals that would become involved, such as Hussein Hamouda, Khalid Mohuddin, Salah Nasser, Anwar Sadat. It was all, or General Mohammed Naguib. Naguib and Nasser basically were chosen as the two people that would become the leaders of the government. But Naguib basically bowed down to Nasser. Nasser was actually more fit. He was actually more oriented and power-driven than the elder Naguib. And so in 1954, the Muslim Brotherhood, seeing that Nasser was a socialist, anti-communist, however, and someone who didn't respect any organization that could be a threat to the Nasser government, tried to hold backdoor meetings with Gamel Abdel Nasser, now the president of Egypt. At this time, in 1948, just a few short years, Hassan al-Banna was assassinated. And so there was no real true leader of the Muslim Brotherhood, even though Sayyid Qutb was seen as the more fit theological presence within the Brotherhood. He never considered himself as the true leader of the movement itself. In 1954, Qutb found out that Nasser's plans behind Qutb's back was not to involve the Brotherhood in government affairs whatsoever, and to basically what the Nasser government wanted to do was basically arrest the entire hierarchy of the Brotherhood, in which the Brotherhood would then collapse. Sayyid Qutb found out about this and basically tried to implement a coup d'etat against Nasser government. But the Nasser government, through the State Security Investigation Services, or the SSI, the intelligence arm, which is a very ruthless and powerful intelligence agency in the Arab world, who already had spies within the Muslim Brotherhood, at this point found out about it and arrested Sayyid Qutb. However, while he was in prison, Qutb would write numerous manuscripts and books, two of which would become very important works. One would be In the Shade of the Quran, and the other is Milestones. Even though his magnum opus is considered In the Shade of the Quran, which is a 30-volume commentary on the Quran itself, these books, which would become the primary influences for future Islamic organizations in the future, as well as Sayyid Qutb's thoughts and ideology about creating an Islamic caliphate in Arab governments, secular Arab governments, would later have a reverberating effect, which would help shape the Islamic landscape in the future. Due to pressure from the Iraqi Prime Minister Abdul Salim Arif, he wrote many letters, numerous invocations to Gamel Nasser to release the enigmatic and troublesome Islamic theologian Sayyid Qutb. And in 1964, he was released. However, 8 months after him being released, Qutb was rearrested and jailed again. He was accused of plotting to overthrow the state and subjected to a sham trial, so to speak, where Nasser had these eyewitnesses, which basically told falsehoods. The trial accumulated in a death sentence for Sayyid Qutb and 6 members of the Muslim Brotherhood. He was sentenced to death for his part in a conspiracy to assassinate Nasser as president. At this time, Nasser was behind, and he was the primary influence behind Pan Arab nationalism. Pan Arab nationalism, which was a socialist movement, basically an Arab democracy that mimicked that of Western decadence, their lifestyle, and numerous Arab countries prospered under Pan Arab nationalism. Countries such as Syria, Iran, Libya, Egypt, to a certain extent, Afghanistan in the very early 21st century and late 20th century. These countries didn't have an Islamist problem. Basically, these radical fundamentalists were basically deposed or hidden in the shadows, so to speak, by these socialist leaders that were very strict in allowing ultra-Orthodox movements to become a threat to their government and to everyday society. But Sayyid Qutb was executed on August 29th, 1966. He was hanged. As soon as he was executed, he was considered a martyr or a shaheed, which means a Muslim who was killed defending his or her property, considered as being labeled a martyr to Muslims worldwide. Immediately, his works began taking root throughout the Muslim world, Sunni and Shia, most notably in the Shia landscape. This would help shape Egyptian society. And so Nasser himself would come under fire for basically committing a death sentence to the most revered man, the most respected Islamic theologian in the world at that time. But on September 28, 1970, Gamel Abdel Nasser died. He died of a heart attack. His vice president was Anwar Sadat. Sadat himself was basically a reformer, more liberal-minded than, say, Gamel Abdel Nasser, who was very strict, someone who would go to the SSI and to enact torture methods on dissidents, those who he would consider religious fundamentalists, even people who were associated with these people. And so throughout the 60s, you had numerous arrests and abuses of torture, human rights abuses that were not reported by the media. The Egyptian government kept this silent. But as soon as Sadat came in, he wanted to revamp the country's economy. He wanted to help and fix the class warfare that still existed in this country that goes back decades at this point. And so in the early 1970s, Sadat went out to improve trade relations with countries such as the Soviet Union, United States, Spain, Germany, even Israel, which was considered an affront to the Arab world, because in 1948, the Arab-Israeli war and the implementation of Israel as a state, as a nation state for Jews, constructed by the Balfour Declaration, influenced by Zionist influences in the United States, such as Louis Brandeis and later Woodrow Wilson. And of course, the Balfour Declaration, which was promoted by Great Britain, and which saw the Zionists organizations like the Stern and Irgun gangs basically assassinate and kill hundreds to even thousands of Palestinians. And this was not reported in the U.S. media. At this time, however, the United States was not, there was basically a split within the State Department about how to treat the Israeli Zionist problem. But one thing was for sure, Egypt, which had a very staunch military, did not help, and basically lost in the war in 1948. But during the 6-Day War, which Israel saw the defeat of Syria, Egypt, in which they captured the Golan Heights, the Gaza Strip. Jordan was also defeated, and this was a resounding moral defeat for the Arab world. This was a truly a key point in Arab history, as well as Egyptian history, because this was the death knell of Pan Arab nationalism, Nasserism, because Nasser was the primary influencer of Arab nationalism in itself in the Arab world. And so the Saudi government, led by its Wahhabi principles, the ultra-Orthodox traditions, religious tradition, began to funnel millions of dollars throughout the Arab world in promoting Wahhabi Islam in these madrasas and mosques, in the hopes of deposing any type of socialist, communist, nationalist points of view. And Egyptian government under Sadat basically allowed this to ferment. In his first couple of years within the presidency, Sadat actually released the hierarchy of the Muslim Brotherhood and those that were affiliated with other smaller Islamic schools of thought and organizations, and allowed these jails to be free of these people, in the hopes that he wanted to be seen as a reformer for the religious sector. However, this would become a fatal problem in the future, not just for the Arab world, but for Anwar Sadat himself and for the country in the future. Egypt, in its own right, was going through a transformation regarding the class warfare that existed through the trade agreements that Anwar Sadat tried to repair. But it wasn't until his peace treaty with Israel that basically gave the motivations for these smaller Islamic organizations, these radical fundamentalist groups, to become more public. And so it wasn't until the peace accords, the Camp David Accords in 1978, which was precipitated by U.S. President Jimmy Carter, in which he invited Anwar Sadat and Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin to Washington, D.C. Sadat in 1977, just a year prior, became the first Arab leader to visit Israel. This incident caused an outrage in the Islamic ultra-Orthodox world, which were in the shadows just coming out to the public. Individuals like Muhammad ibn Abdul al-Faraj of the Egyptian Islamic Jihad, or in the earlier title, al-Jihad. Omar Abdel Rahman, and other notable Egyptian influences that resided in the country, these groups that would later come out and basically cause a problem in the country itself. In 1978, under the peace accords, the Camp David Accords, Sadat returned back to Egypt and, quote, "Let us put an end to wars. Let us reshape life on the solid basis of equity and truth, as it is this call which reflected the will of the Egyptian people, of the great majority of the Arab and Israeli peoples, and indeed of millions of men, women, and children around the world that you are today honoring. And these hundreds of millions will judge to what extent every responsible leader in the Middle East has responded to the hopes of mankind." End quote. What Sadat wanted to do was repair the Israeli and Arab image, because at this point it was still shaken to its core with the foundation of the Israeli state in 1948, its Zionist ideology that represses, even to this day, the Palestinians, which was a problem in the 50s and 60s to most of the Arab world, especially to governments in Libya, in Syria, Jordan, during those periods of the 60s to the 80s. Not so much now. And so Anwar Sadat wanted to repair this image, not knowing that there was a plan by members of the Egyptian Islamic Jihad, al-Jihad, and the Gamma Islamiyah. Individuals such as Abu al-Zamar, who's a colonel in the Egyptian military, Khalid Islambouli, a general in the Egyptian military, a lieutenant general in the Egyptian military, as well as Omar Abdel Rahman, Muhammad ibn al-Faraj, and other notable names such as Nabil al-Maghrab, Dr. Abdul Monin Abu al-Fatu, Dr. Ibrahim al-Farani, Abdel Akr Hamad. In which they planned to assassinate Sadat. And according to Muhammad al-Faraj, Ibn al-Faraj, they wanted to implement an Islamic government led by the Quran and the Sunnah. In October 6, 1981, Anwar Sadat was assassinated by members of these groups that were hidden in army trucks. That was there was a military parade in which Sadat attended. In that, members of this radical group involved with the plot came out and went up to the facade where Sadat was sitting and opened fire, killing him, injuring a dozen others. One of them, his vice president, Hosni Mubarak. He was shot in the wrist. immediately after Sadat's assassination, there was a huge crackdown on the Islamic religious sector. Hosni Mubarak became the president, and Mubarak was completely opposite of Sadat, where Mubarak basically was Nasser 2.0, but this time Mubarak was much more critical of the radical fundamentalists in his country. Over 1,500 people who were all suspected of being behind the plot or being suspected of being involved with groups like al-Jihad, the Egyptian Islamic Jihad, the Gamma Islamiyah. Notable names that would be arrested: Isam al-Kamari, Ayman al-Zawahiri, Sayyid Hanafi, Sayyid Imam Abdul Aziz, who would go by the nom de guerre Dr. Fadl, Rafai Taha, Nabil Abdel Fattah, in which many of these people, and of course there were hundreds and hundreds of others that were arrested and sent to Torah prison, where they were basically tortured by the state security investigation services. Brutal torture methods, including electric shocks to the feet, to the stomach, to the genitals, beatings, slamming their heads on the concrete walls, even some summary executions, in which created ordinary Muslims that were not involved with these groups, not involved with the plot, to become radical fundamentalists in their own right. This created a huge problem for the future of Egypt, because many of these groups also adhered to the principles of Sayyid Qutb. Sayyid Qutb ideology, which came from Hassan al-Banna's Muslim Brotherhood decree that secular Arab governments are to be replaced by Islamic institutions within that country and create a caliphate within that state, in which that would then carry on to other secular governments within the Arab world, in which the Muslim Brotherhood wanted from Spain to Indonesia a truly Islamic caliphate. But not by violent decree. But Sayyid Qutb's perversion of Islam was through his hatred toward the West and toward the political Zionist government of Israel. Qutb's ideology then took on a raw and radical form by individuals such as Anwar Abdel Rahman, Ayman al-Zawahiri, Sayyid Imam Abdul Aziz. These individuals would later have direct influence toward creating other radical fundamentalist groups. So Egyptian society would suffer because these Egyptian radical fundamentalist groups grew underground as Mubarak's torture practices and his repressive, judicially repressive actions toward even just Egyptian society that was suspected of harboring or aiding these people, in which class warfare would then take a more a secondary turn in its own right. It wasn't as bad as, say, the early 19th or 20th centuries. It improved, and improved under Sadat. But Mubarak was considered very repressive, not very well liked within the lower class or the religious sector in its own right. So Zawahiri was released, but his torture, in which he basically relented and gave the Egyptian SSI information leading to the arrest of his close friend and associate Isam al-Kamari, who was suspected of being behind the plot, but he wasn't involved. And neither was al-Zawahiri. He wasn't involved with the assassination plot. Al-Kamari was arrested, and Zawahiri never forgave himself because he basically became an informant. He went to a mosque where Kamari was known to go, and he pointed him out, in which Isam al-Kamari was arrested. Ayman al-Zawahiri, actually, who is a physician, went to Afghanistan to join in the Soviet-Afghanistan war, in which he offered his services in Pakistan, in Islamabad, to the Islamic Red Cross, the Crescent Red Cross, in helping injured Afghan soldiers to fight against the communist regime in Afghanistan. Al-Zawahiri brought his own ideology, and he manipulated another young Saudi who was considered an extremist. And his name was Osama bin Laden. Omar Abdul Rahman was considered an extremist in the country of Egypt, but he was released because he was blind, hence the nickname Blind Sheikh. And so with that, Rahman, in 1990, through a U.S. embassy in Cairo, would apply for a U.S. visa, not knowing that the visa officers were actually CIA case agents. And at this time, Rahman was under a terrorist watch list. However, that didn't stop him from getting his visa application approved, not once, not twice, but 3 times. He enters the United States, and he becomes the imam at the Masjid al-Salam Mosque in Jersey City, New Jersey, forcibly deposing the former imam, Mustafa Shalabi, who is more of a pro-liberal Muslim. He wanted to use the funds that were coming from the Maktab al-Khidmat in Brooklyn, New York, and through the funds that were generated in the Masjid al-Salam to help repair Afghanistan and help the Afghans. Shalabi was assassinated, and Rahman became the imam. Meanwhile, in Pakistan, Ayman al-Zawahiri, who was close friends to Osama bin Laden, manipulating him, because bin Laden was a millionaire at this point, basically created some malicious lies about another notable imam in his own right, Abdul Azam. Abdul Azam, who was the head of the Maktab al-Khidmat, the Afghan Services Bureau, which was the main recruiting office in Pakistan that would help create funds to get Arabs, foreign Arabs, and Afghans to join the fight against the Soviets. Azam was assassinated. No one knew who killed him, but Ayman al-Zawahiri, Osama bin Laden, became the new heads of the Afghan Services Bureau, in which that would help to create an organization called Al-Qaeda in the future. Al-Qaeda became a terrorist organization which was led under the principles of Wahhabi Islam and the Kharijite principles that were carried on to Wahhabi Islam to notable individuals such as Sayyid Qutb, Ayman al-Zawahiri, Omar Abdul Rahman, Osama bin Laden, and in the future, people like Muhammad Atta, involved with the 9/11 attacks, considered the ringleader. All the hijackers that were involved with the 9/11 attacks, as well as Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, who was the primary influencer of Tawhid al-Jihad, which later became Islamic State in Iraq, which now becomes the Islamic State in the Levant. Groups like Boko Haram, Abu Sayyaf, Jaish-e-Mohammed in Pakistan, the Islamic State in Syria, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, through the Maghreb, Al-Qaeda in the Arab Peninsula, Al-Qaeda in the Maghreb, Abu Sayyaf in the Philippines and Indonesia. All these groups, these fundamentalist groups, all these individuals, such as I named before, come from the Kharijite tradition, come from the Wahhabi principles of Saudi Arabia, which helped influence all these individuals that adhere to Sayyid Qutb's political Islamic doctrines. And to the current moment, Egypt still has this problem of Islamic fundamentalism, as well as most of the Gulf and countries that once prospered under Pan Arab nationalism, such as Iran, Syria, Libya, Afghanistan, are now destabilized regions with the help of the neoconservatives, the Zionists, and the Wahhabists, who helped to destroy true Arab hegemony in the region.
Extremist groups tend to shift from religion per se to religious commitment. Does that make sense? In other words, it's not like the traditional way of imbibing the tradition, believing in the tradition, taking on the tradition, but the issue becomes commitment, and usually commitment to a cause. And although this is not necessarily wrong, depending on the cause, it can be very harmful because that cause can become everything. That cause can become almost like an idol, a fixation. And in that context, religion often becomes your identity. In other words, not just your belief, not just your practice, but my identity. Okay? As opposed to the others who don't have that identity. And often, especially in a global context, it gives me an identity in a faceless world. So, if a person is alienated, if a person has no life in their meaning, if you live maybe in the slums of Paris, then this gives me identity in a faceless world. My religion becomes my identity. And, of course, religion must be much deeper than that. And, again, this is not just true of us. This is true of the extremist, wherever you find the extremist, whether they're a fascist or a Leninist, a racist, a European racist, an American racist, right-wing, whatever they might be. Extremism often expresses itself in a personal quest for immediately accessible knowledge. In other words, pamphlets. We read pamphlets, we read easy books, immediately accessible knowledge, maybe tapes, CDs, not careful study, not in-depth study. And often, this is in defiance of authority. I mean by that, in defiance of traditional authority, of the schools, the tradition, the teachers. As one of the great scholars that I knew in Morocco used to say, who was a great hadith scholar, he would say that I studied hadith all my life. I studied Islam all my life. And a young man who doesn't even pray goes into the movie theater, comes out, buys a pamphlet, and the next day he's calling me a kafir. So this is an example of the quick fix. In other words, immediately accessible knowledge and then defiance of authority. That you who've studied Islam all your life and your grandfather studied it and it's like, I can condemn you in 5 minutes because I read this pamphlet and I saw that what you're doing doesn't suit that. And again, we're not just talking about ourselves. This is typical of extremism wherever you find it. So therefore, the religiosity in extremism is often personal experience, as I said before, and not legacy. It's not legacy. How does extremism relate to tradition? Well, you can look at American right-wing evangelicals and see how that works. And you can look at Jewish extremists and see how that works. Selective retrieval of the past. Selective retrieval. In other words, I go back into the Bible and everything that fits what I want, I take. And what doesn't fit, I leave. So we must be careful too not to be guilty of that. In other words, to go back into the Islamic tradition, which is rich, beautiful, life-giving, and which is the middle way. And then just take the bits and pieces that justify what I want, that preoccupation that I have. And in Islam, in this great tradition that we have, with these great scholars of the past and the present, whenever you take a bit or a piece and you focus on it only, what do we call that? Sectarianism. Sectarianism. That's firqa. That's firqa. And this was the nature of the Khawarij. Right? That they just take one part of the prophetic legacy, they insist upon it, and then they go outside of it. And there were others that did the same thing. But the extremist tends to do that. Extremism is a sickness. And it's very important that we protect ourselves from that.